Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Camila Pollard, and I am a public policy student and a Dean's Brand Ambassador for the UC Riverside School of Public Policy. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar with our special guest, Dr. Paulette Brown-Hinds, the founder of Voice Media Ventures. But before I introduce our guest speaker, I would first like to spend a few moments going over the format for today's webinar. For the first part of today's online event, Dr. Brown-Hinds will give opening remarks. Afterwards, I will bring up a panel of student discussants for a student Q&A. Then we will open up some time for questions from the audience at the very end. Audience members, if you have any questions you would like to pose during the Q&A session, please do not hesitate to send them via chat in the Q&A box below. Audience members, you can submit your questions anytime throughout the seminar via the Q&A feature. You do not have to wait till the audience Q&A to do that. I will pose the audience questions to Dr. Brown-Hinds directly once we reach the audience Q&A portion of today's event. So just submit it through the Q&A box feature and not through the chat. Now it is my distinct honor to introduce our special guest speaker for today's webinar. Dr. Paulette Brown-Hinds is a founder of Voice Media Ventures and the second generation publisher of Voice and Black Voice News. The multimedia company includes News Weekly, print and digital editions, film and new media content production, and a strategic communications firm specializing in community outreach and engagement. Dr. Brown-Hinds has over 30 years experience in media, communications, and community engagement, and has served as the lead Black media strategist for a number of statewide government and political campaigns. She has won statewide and national awards for her column Rants and Raves. As an educator, she teaches an annual course at UCR, connecting students in media and the arts with the broader community. Her interest in doing work for the public good has led to serve her on boards of the James Irvine Foundation with the mission to expand opportunity for the people of California, Cal Matters, the California Press Foundation, and the California News Publishers Association. In 2019, she served as president of the board, becoming the first African-American elected to lead the organization. We are very excited to have you here today, Dr. Brown-Hinds.
Thank you so much. I would like to start by trying to share my screen. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. And I know I was asked to talk a little bit about what inspired me to get involved in media and communications, and to talk a little bit about the firm Voice Media Ventures that I founded, and some of the work we do, just to kick it off before we do the Q&A. So I have created a PowerPoint. I do want to start by just talking a little bit about my background, since you were curious about my inspiration for doing the work that I do now. I come from a family of committed community servants. And not just my parents, but my maternal and paternal grandparents were community-minded and focused on making their community a better place. My father comes from a rural part of North Carolina, and for generations, the family really worked in that region for civil rights for their community members. They were part of civic organizations. They fought for equal rights for the African-American community. My grandfather actually risked his life to register voters after the Voting Rights Act was passed. And my grandmother really raised 9 children while working to help provide for the family. Their porch there in that rural part of the state really became a place where the community gathered for information and encouragement. I always think about it as kind of a sacred space. On my mother's side, community was also valued, where service was valued above self. My grandmother Melba was known to take in anyone who needed shelter. She was very civic minded. She encouraged her children to be community problem solvers. So if you saw a problem in the community, she encouraged you to also find a solution. you couldn't just complain. And my grandfather was a small business owner who gave back to the community. And actually the business that he started in Los Angeles over 60 years ago is still there today. And my uncles run that business. So my childhood was really built on that foundation. Our family dinner conversations were about community activities. Later on, when my father was elected to the school board in our town, our conversations were about equitable solutions to educational problems that plagued our community. During campaign season, we talked about voter registration and voter education. So we worked campaigns. That was just like our childhood. And very involved in things like the Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts. When my parents assumed the stewardship of the Black Voice News, which I'll talk about more in a moment, the conversations really shifted towards advocacy and community journalism. But really the community part of that remains central. So it's how do we tell stories to change the community for the better? You know, those are the kind of questions that we'd be asked at the dinner table. How do we use the newspaper as a platform for action? What are the important problems that our community is struggling to overcome? How can we tell those stories? So that's really, really what inspired me to do the work that I do today. I at first thought I was going to be in politics. I thought I'd say that since this is a School of Public Policy presenting this webinar. Between my junior and senior year of high school, I worked in Washington, D.C. as an intern with my congressman, our local congressman here, Congressman George Brown. And I fell in love with policy, with Washington, D.C., with political power, just being in that space. And I thought, this is what I want to do, until I went to my first year in undergrad and took my first political science course and realized it wasn't for me. And I remember just saying, I don't know what I want to do now. And I became an undeclared major until I found English. And I kind of returned back to that, the stories and storytelling as a powerful force. So I ended up finishing that degree and then coming to UCR for my graduate work, which was very instrumental in my growth. And I studied Black literature, very interested in early Black literature. So some of the early Black publishers, if you on the screen, you see Ida B. Wells quoted, major force in Black journalism. I learned about, Frederick Douglass, other famous publishers. So I was able to marry my home life and upbringing with my interests, my professional interests. And so I thought then being an English professor would be my destiny, and realized no, that wasn't it. I spent 2 short years as a tenure track professor at the University of Cincinnati before I realized I really wanted to be back in the community, be back in my community, working in community media, and specifically be a part of that tradition of the Black press. So I took over the family business and ended up creating this company that has at its foundation the Black Voice News. But we also expanded that, and I'll talk about that in a moment. It allows me to work with my family. I still work with my parents. I work with my brother who runs our foundation, focuses on education and historical empathy. I work with my husband, who's a professor there at UCR, Kirby-Hinds, who is my partner of Voice Media Ventures. And I get to indirectly work with my younger sister, Regina, who took over California Black Media, which is an advocacy organization that my father and mother founded 20 years ago. So I get to still work with her in that space. But what we do with Voice Media Ventures is we still focus on producing quality information, but also experiences that inform, educate, and inspire. And and provide thoughtful strategies to engage and connect communities. So that's kind of what we do as a company. And I was asked to just kind of briefly talk about the company and some of the different initiatives and parts of the work that we do. As you heard in my bio, we kind of do a lot. When my parents founded Brown Publishing Company, they actually had taken over the stewardship of the Black Voice News. A lot of people think my parents are the founders of the Black Voice News, but it was actually founded by students at UC Riverside in the 1972. I know a lot of people don't know that. And these students, led by artist Lily, was one of the main students. They published it because they didn't feel that the Highlander newspaper on campus really spoke for them. And they wanted something that spoke for them and told their stories from their perspective. And so they published it on campus until they all graduated. And then it ended up in the community with another publisher who was publishing the American News in San Bernardino. It's another Black paper, quite a few Black papers in this region. And my parents had been doing some kind of community work. They found that their kind of civic activities were really tied to storytelling in the community. My mother is a prolific photographer. She doesn't do it as much now, but we have thousands of photos from decades of Black Inland Empire events. And my father was writing columns. His background was in employment, looking at employment discrimination. So he was writing columns about that. And they had the opportunity to purchase the paper, to become stewards of the paper. And they took that on in 1980, and they formed Brown Publishing Company. And they really modeled the work they were doing in the spirit of, in the tradition of the Black press, which is really one of pointing out discrimination and fighting for social justice. So that is the foundation of the work that we do. But then from there, we have really grown. As I mentioned, we do film and multimedia. My husband is a playwright, a professor there at UCR, screenwriter, and had taken a story that was an important story in Riverside of a police shooting of a young Black girl that I'll talk about in a moment, who my mother encouraged him to write a play about it. And he finally did write a play about the Taisha Miller shooting and Taisha Miller. And we ended up later turning that into a film. So that was a few years ago. We won quite a few toured film festivals all over the world and won quite a few awards at film festivals. But that also encouraged us to do even more in multimedia. So we're launching, actually in a few weeks, two new shows. One is going to be a YouTube conversation series that will be hosted by my niece, who will then be the third generation to work with the business, who's actually a PhD, a student in anthropology there at UC Riverside. So it's called The Conversation with Jordan Brown. She's going to focus on her first show is on education and going back to school under the pandemic. And so she's talking to educators and what it means for Black kids, especially, and Black families. So that's her first show. And then the second one is one of our new journalists, Saida Malin, who really wants to tackle voting for kind of the folks who don't vote that often. So it's the non-high propensity voters, folks who don't vote a lot. She wants to really talk about and break down, and she wants to learn. Which is great. She's a young journalist. She wants to learn with the audience. So that's going to be a IG and Facebook Live series that we do leading up to the election, this November election. So we're excited about that. And then I have Mapping Black California, which is an initiative I started several years ago, after meeting Jack Dangerman, who is the founder of Esri, the global leader in GIS technology, geospatial technology. And I just became fascinated with the technology and how it could help us tell stories, and how it could help us visualize data. And how can I think it help inform the community? So I started learning about community mapping. And I thought, if you take a community newspaper concept and you make it digital, like GIS is right at the center of that. And so I've been working on that for a few years, recently hired a project manager who's taking us into, really new levels, really working on some exciting maps. We've done some mapping around COVID. We've done some mapping with census, of course, is one of our big projects. And then we're doing some other mapping that I can share later. We're doing a Black at Work map to look at like Black essential workers, to tell that story. So anyway, it's a crowdsourced map. I'm really excited about that. Really trying to take the technology and use it in a way that benefits the community. Once again, going back to that foundational background that I had with putting the community at the center of the work. Our foundation, the Black Voice Foundation, my brother runs, we do Underground Railroad study tours. It saddens me this summer was the first summer in over 20 years that we could not do the tour because of the pandemic. And we take educators, administrators, parents, retracing the steps of the Underground Railroad. Once again, something that started with the reporting that we did in the newspaper. Actually, my mother had gone on a tour as a journalist of Underground Railroad sites, and ended up being asked to present kind of a workshop to educators after, and this was in one of our local school district, after an educator had told her elementary school children, our class, that slavery was good for Africans. It civilized Africans. That was it became a big story. It became a national story. And so one of the administrators in the school district had been reading my mother's articles about these sites and said, hey, can you come and do a workshop? Like, they need to understand this history. And so after my mom did the workshop, the teachers became so excited. They're like, can we do a tour? And so we went about putting together this tour, my mother and a tour operator and this administrator at the school district. And, 22 years later, we've had over 2,500 people participate in the tour. We went from 1 tour a year to 4. And then from that, we've also added a couple of elements. One is we have a collection of African American artifacts. Actually, they're American artifacts, but they're from the antebellum period, and they really tell the real story of slavery. We have slave shackles, we have bills of sale, we have all types of first edition narratives, like Frederick Douglass's My Bondage and My Freedom, or Solomon Northrop's 12 Years a Slave. And so we've started to create these kind of workshops where we help people talk about empathy, using history and history of the Underground Railroad as the foundation for that. And it comes from the work we did with our tours. And once again, now with the collection, we're able to, for folks who can't go on the tour, we're able to at least have that conversation. And my brother leads that effort for us. And then finally, the consulting business, the consulting firm is something that really was an imperative. It was an imperative because of the type of business we have. And when you have a business that is kind of an advocacy business, you can't rely on one source of revenue. And as newspapers in general struggle with advertising revenue, we struggled even more because we often would piss off the very people that we would need to ask for advertising dollars, right? Like, advertise with us. And, you know, we're talking about discrimination in their workplace. And so, you know, so I needed to create a business model that allowed us to continue to do the type of work that we need to do, but then continue to pay, right, our team and our staff to produce it. So the consulting business became that opportunity, and I've worked statewide projects. Our largest one was just recently the census, where we did statewide African American media and outreach. But have done all types of other campaigns and projects through that business. I have to do a quick just acknowledgement of my parents. I try to do this, and I love these pictures of them. So that's one of the reasons I use. And this is like, you know, my mother being like the journalist, thinking about, you know, asking that question, and my dad, you know, sitting back on his phone. But they really provided the template for how to cover the Black Lives Matter movement that we are talking about today. You know, I mentioned Taisha Miller back in 1998 when she was, you know, killed by Riverside police asleep in her car. And, you know, I use this picture because and I plan on talking about it more, so I won't go into a lot of detail. I'll talk about it more, you know, during the Q&A. But I use this picture because, you know, once all of the cameras are gone, like once the national media is gone, the local community newspapers are still there. And they're still there telling the story. They're still there trying to help find solutions. And they're trying to bring the community together. So I like to, you know, kind of acknowledge that the template that we use today for us, at least as a Black Voice News, really comes from the work that my parents have done over decades. And I always, you know, use the quote, it's more important to make a difference than to make a dollar, because that's how we lived. And I always had to think about that as a business owner. Since, you know, you wanted me to talk a little bit about the business, I always had to think about that and put making the difference more important than the dollar. So I was always like, so how do we, you know, generate the revenue we need to continue to do the work? You know, and that allows us to then do the work that we're doing now in regards to the Black Lives Matter movement here. We really focus on the region. We've you know, interviewed our local Inland Empire Black Lives Matter movement leaders. I've been fortunate this year, even with the pandemic, even with the crisis, not just within our industry, but the crisis, the economic crisis that has stopped the economy. We've been fortunate that when we've been able to still generate the kind of revenue that we need to grow. So we've actually hired 3 new journalists since the pandemic hit. 2 are part-time because they're still students. And then 1 just graduated from college. And so they bring a different perspective, which I really appreciate. They've done some multimedia work where they've gone out to protest and interviewed people and edited the video, and we've been able to share it on social media. And they've been also able to learn from our more seasoned journalist, Stephanie Williams, who really digs into stories and takes months to do a really good job on certain stories. So she's able to learn, you know, from them, which is great. And then they're able to learn from her. So I'm excited about where we are right now as a company and the work that we're able to do through Voice Media Ventures. As I mentioned, you know, the newspaper started at UCR. We'll continue to do hopefully the good work that when the students started that, you know, paper they had in mind in the decades that my parents ran the paper, you know, we hope to honor that legacy. And then now, you know, seeing the next generation, as I mentioned, Jordan Brown has her show that she's working on. And then my other niece, Kennedy Wilson, is working on a master's in GIS. So she's our project assistant for our Mapping Black California project, and has really great ideas for some of the work we're doing. She's a policy person, actually, very interested in public policy, and she's interested in mapping. So she's trying to bring the two together, and we're just lucky that we get to benefit from that exploration. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, hopefully. Yay. And I'm ready for the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown-Hinds, for your remarks. It was really amazing and inspiring just hearing all of this. At this point, I am now going to bring in my fellow classmates for a student panel discussion. Our first question comes from Maddie Bunting.
Thanks, Camila. And again, thank you, Dr. Brown-Hinds, for being here. I echo what I think a lot of our audience is saying in the chat, which, what a family affair. I mean, it's amazing that not only generation to generation, but it seems like everyone within the generation is doing their part and might have their own little interest, on the side, but I just think it's amazing. And as Camila just said, it's really inspiring.
Thank you.
For those in our audience who may not know, could you briefly describe the history of the Black press? And in your opinion, what does the future of the Black press look like?
Yes, definitely. So the Black press has historically served an important function, like as a civic actor. You could hear that in my remarks about the way we talk about the Black Voice News. And I think it's a critical sector of community media. So I always like to look at it in the context of it's like a community media source. They are vital, trusted messengers in their community. They are keepers of the collective memory of the community. They chronicle the history. Then they also deliver essential news and information. And, some people say, they speak with, of, and for the dynamic of the community that they serve. The Black press in particular is almost 2 centuries old. It's a history of service and advocacy that started as an outgrowth of the demand for freedom and justice, which, it was during slavery. So it was kind of abolition of slavery, served as a public defender of the civil and human rights of the Black community, and has really served as a platform for reform in this country. So from the abolition of slavery to the fight for the franchise and the vote, right? Agitating against mob violence. I had that quote from Ida B. Wells, spent, her professional career speaking out against lynching and kind of domestic terrorism that we experienced during that era, the fight for civil rights, the calls to migrate to the north or to the west, and to protest discrimination in all its forms. So the first paper was the Freedom's Journal, and its credo was too long of others spoken for us. We wish to plead our own cause, because there were abolitionist papers before them that were white-owned papers, and they felt that it needed to be from themselves, from their Black perspective. You see the same kind of thread when you look at the 1940s. They're still reforming, they're still fighting for equal rights, civil rights, fighting against racial injustice, fighting against still domestic terrorism, which we still see today, right? And their credo then was like, we'll crusade for all things that are right and just. And they will condemn all that is unjust. And they will be crusaders. And they will be, still have the cardinals of journalism with accuracy, fairness, and objectivity. And I think, the 2020, what we're seeing now is really no different. I see it as the same. Black press, we're just not covering the protests for justice, but trying to contextualize the movement for social justice, like with that long history that, I just outlined, but normally from a hyper-local perspective, depending on the community and the geography. I know when, there were the protests in Ferguson, I think it was the St. Louis American that was like on the ground there. When we had the Taisha Miller shooting, we were, on the ground here. Stephon Clark, you have, Sacramento Observer, publishing there, knows the families, knows the community. So it's very hyper local work. And it's often, even though it speaks for the community, we often direct that reporting at policymakers and community change makers. I think that's intentional. And I think we continue to try to tell the story from a community lens. So our coverage of the Taisha Miller shooting in Riverside over 20 years ago kept the protesters' messages amplified, kept the pressure on the city officials and the state electeds to do something. And they knew that we were, watching, critiquing, editorializing solutions. That was, I felt, well, at least what my parents felt their job was. And I see that across the country with other Black press publishers. And when the spotlight is gone, like I said, when all those cameras are gone, we remain watchful in those communities, which is why I think the work we do is just so important. The question about the future, of course, I don't know what the future holds. Our entire sector, just as the news industry, everyone knows how newspapers are struggling. We're in a crisis. We have to rethink and reimagine our business models. So much of our model was tied to advertising revenue, and that model has been broken for quite a while. So I am hopeful because there are people experimenting with business models. There some great projects right now. There's like a renewed interest in supporting and funding resiliency in the sector, specifically with Black press. So you have a philanthropy that is kind of helping to fill the void right now. We received a Facebook grant once the pandemic hit. $100,000 Facebook grant was so instrumental for us to be able to hire those folks that I hired, but also to have someone in-house thinking about audience development and revenue models. Like that's her job, is just to think about how do we go from 90% advertising to a much more diverse and a mix within the business of the newspaper. What I did to make it through after the last recession, when we had advertisers who had been with us for 14 years go out of business overnight. I mean, it was just devastating. And so what I did there after that was make sure I built up a diversity, and that's why Voice Media Ventures has all of those different companies and different elements, so that we could diversify the revenue model. Now there's a focus on just diversifying within the newspaper. And I'm seeing that across the country. It's a national conversation. It's a national effort. So you have organizations like the Local Media Association, which recently launched a fund for the Black press. You have the Borealis Racial Equity and Journalism Fund. A lot of Black legacy publishers were funded through that. The City of New York Center for Community Media just recently launched a Black Media Initiative to support Black media outlets through advocacy, training, and research. Even here in California, I'm a part of an effort with my sister, California Black Media, with Ethnic Media Services, with Latino Media Collaborative, and Cal Matters, where we're looking at how to empower our ethnic media sector and Black media is a part of that, help them transform during this moment of crisis, and really help them develop new business models so they can be here for the long haul. So we're excited about that. One other thing we want to do with that is also cultivate the new media entrepreneurs. I'm really passionate about that. What does that look like? And we're seeing some, digital, we're seeing some digital outlets across the country, young Black journalists. We are seeing some nonprofit news sites, but I would love to be able to cultivate more of that in California. So, I'm hopeful. Although, it's a challenge. It's really a challenge to see how we're going to make it through. But I'm hopeful about what the future holds. I'm optimistic, though. I'm an optimistic person by nature.
Me too. And you just mentioned, Gen Z is entering the workforce for kind of the first time. Millennials are maybe getting higher up within their careers, and we utilize social media. And
Yes.
you mentioned that, newspapers have been struggling. That's a well-known fact. They've been turning to the online platform as well, and some going paperless.
Yeah.
Do you believe social media transformed the Black press in any way? Have you seen any greater or expanded community engagement, maybe specifically with the younger generations?
Right. I mean, that's where, when you look at studies on where younger people get their information, it's social media. So as a legacy, I'll just talk from our perspective, as a legacy outlet, we have to have a social media strategy to reach, the complete diversity of our own audience in terms of age, especially. Facebook is they're trying to be better at working with news media. I mean, there's algorithms that change, it's just, anyway, there's so many problems with, just even getting trying to reach your own audience on social media, but it's something that we have to struggle with. And actually they're trying to be a partner. Like they have a whole news division now that you could actually talk to people as you walk through, some of your challenges and problems. I think the bigger challenge is just how quickly the technology changes and platforms change. So where, Facebook was at, a couple of years ago, then it's like, no, you're not on Instagram. You need to be on Instagram. And then it's, Twitter, like a certain audience that gets their news from Twitter. And then, everybody's talking about TikTok now and all these, and it's so that's the harder part. And I think because, small outlets especially are so already under-resourced, you don't have someone there who could spend the time to do it. I try to just invest back in the company, and I try to find smart ways to do that. Like I said, hiring, students who they haven't finished college yet. They're in the middle of their program, but the way they think about, they're digital natives, unlike me and unlike my editor who's older than me. They're digital natives, so they're already thinking, how's this going to play on Facebook? How's this going to play on Instagram? Where, how should we, what should we tag? What should the hashtags be? What should the captions be? What should the image be? And so I'm hoping that we're able to catch up. That's like some of these initiatives that I mentioned, just, answering your last question, the work we're doing with Media in Color, that's part of it is tech solutions to help the organizations. And there's so many webinars. One thing that being remote has helped us, I think, do is kind of slow down and try to take advantage of all the information that is out there to help our companies. And so there are all many great webinars that I see and that we try to share, and that I see my fellow publishers, even older publishers, trying to understand. Yeah, I mean, you have to be there. Even if you don't like it, you have to be there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown-Hinds, for your response. Our next question we have is from Daisy Gonzalez.
Thank you, Camilla. Dr. Brown-Hinds, I wanted to ask, and I think recently a lot of people have been seeing, some discrepancies about news and events as portrayed by the mainstream television media and other news outlets. I wanted to ask, how important is it for people to see media from the Black press as opposed to the mainstream media, given these discrepancies?
Right. And what's interesting is kind of now this push from mainstream to like hire Black journalists. Like, it's really interesting to me. We've seen it before, but it's interesting to me. But I said this before. I believe this media ownership matters. Perspective matters. Even when we talk about unbiased reporting, we have to ask ourselves whose voices are elevated, right? Who are the sources? Who do the sources that we use trust, or that they use trust? That's something that we talk, just in terms of community media, we talk quite a bit about, right now. After, the latest protest, you have mainstream media outlets talking about, racism and systemic racism. I was watching a webinar that featured a fellow Black media executive. I think she was a radio station executive, owned like a Black family-owned radio station in on the East Coast. And she said, I never thought I'd see the day where mainstream white-led organizations were having this like thoughtful and deep conversations about anti-Black racism. And she said it's a bit frustrating. She said it's like wow, we need to do something about this, like this moment that they have. And but there's still this trust gap that has to be overcome, right? And I see it all the time with as a community news publisher. Actually, I mentioned the Taisha Miller shooting. The way we covered that shooting back in 1998, and gosh, we wrote about it. First off, it was front page news for like over a year, or we really kept the story important in the community conversation. But there was even a scholarly article that was written about the different ways that we covered that shooting and the way that the Press Enterprise, which is the local daily here, which covered it. What sources they considered valid versus what sources we considered valid, how we treated the protests. Like, there were weekly protests that went on for a year, and we covered them, right? We were there with them. We kept them on the front page. So it's, and as I mentioned, fighting for justice and equality costs us money, to be honest. But as Ida Wells said, we have to, continue to shine the light on the truth. And we have to expect people in power and positions of power to want to dim that light, which makes it harder for us to fulfill our mission. But we have to continue to do the work and cover it from that perspective. I'll never forget when I was publishing. My parents were still publishers, but I worked with the business, and we had a meeting with the city assistant city manager in Riverside, and we were meeting with him to talk about advertising, legal advertising in the paper. They had to do legal advertising, so it was like, you could do it with us as well. And I'll never forget him holding up our newspaper and saying, how do you expect us to advertise inside the paper when you're bashing our police department and bashing us on the front page? And I was like, we were like, you would never pose that question to the daily paper, which is what we said to him. This is us doing our job. And we have to do it from our perspective. Another example of how we see things differently, and why it's important to have a Black press is something that happened actually recent stories we were covering. And not recent, when I say recent, I mean like in the past few years, because it's a story that we've been working on covering for like 2 years. But it's just an example of how we see things differently or care about things maybe differently than mainstream media, or that some things they often ignore. So we were writing a story, doing some work on some corruption at a local water district. And it was corruption and then overreach by board members. And the source that we had was a Black woman who was an employee there within the department. She was being discriminated against, but she was also like witness to much of the corruption. So she was like, I'm being discriminated against and all of this stuff is going on. You need to do something about it. And she felt that we were the only ones who could really help her. So we talked to her. My father, as publisher emeritus at the time, kind of took on the story because he loves like any of the employment discrimination work, since that was his profession. He loves. So he started digging in and covering that story, doing all kinds of research. He brought me in. I did a little bit of editorializing in my column, and then our features writer did some more writing on it. We ended up uncovering some things. We sent stories to the state auditor. We sent it to the DA's office, the Fair Political Practice Commission, and really what ended up happening, the pressure that those stories are placing on the board caused the board members who weren't part of the corruption but allowed it to happen, right? They were kind of complicit. It kind of motivated them to work together to sideline the bad actors on the board and try to clean up the mess that's been made. Well, what's interesting about it is when the daily newspaper, the mainstream paper, finally picked up the story, the journalist got it all wrong. Like he didn't know who was corrupt. He didn't know who was clean. He really didn't know. And he even filed a public records request for our public records request. Like he wanted to know what we had asked for to tell our story, because he didn't see it. He just didn't see it. And he thought he could see the same thing we saw with the documents, right? So he does a public records request, he gets the documents that we asked for, and he thinks that he can understand the story, not realizing that because of the relationships we had in the community, because we're actually in this community, that we're able to fill in gaps and connect dots. That's just one example of the difference between the two, continued difference between the two, and the need for the work that we do. I mean, we have it happen all the time, but that was when he made a public records request for our public records request. That was so telling.
Thank you for that critical perspective. You're very right. A lot of it has to do with these trusting gaps and building relationships with the community, and so they can shine the light on these important stories. But thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Paulette Brown-Hinds. What you were saying, it really reminded me of like what we're seeing right now with the discrepancies like within the mainstream media and what the Black media is presenting, because a lot of people don't know there's still protests of Black Lives Matter going on like across the country, but it's just not being covered in our regular news. And I just think it's just really interesting how it's getting kind of swept under the rug or presented in a different light than what it really is happening right now. But my next question, it's about the lack of diversity within the news and the media. I was wondering if you knew why we have so much lack of diversity and what we can do to get better representation within the media.
Well, it's a good question. I'll start and I'll start and end by saying, I hope we look at ownership as the news industry changes. I hope that we have more Black media entrepreneurs or journalists really thinking about controlling their own space. But to answer that question about diversity, I think that the racial justice reckoning of 2020 hit newsrooms too, right? They've always had, mainstream newsrooms have always had a diversity problem. People have been of color, been underrepresented, and the newsrooms, really rarely reflect the populations that they serve. I was looking at a study by the Knight Foundation, just a recent study, and one of the key findings was there was like a strong majority of Americans say news organizations should hire to increase diversity of their reporting staffs. Some people think it's a pipeline issue. I think that's partially the problem. Just this week, Carla Murphy released a survey of 101 former journalists of color. I think she was the one, so 101 former journalists of color. Mainly, I think it ended up being half of them maybe Black women, but she called the project Leavers. And it was sparked by this kind of recent outpouring of grievances on Twitter by Black journalists telling these kind of horror stories about, in newsroom horror stories. And she had been a journalist herself for several years before leaving. And she really wanted to understand why people leave not just the job, but like leave the entire sector, like they leave the profession. And it's not a large enough study. And like I said, I just saw it. It was just posted like yesterday. And most of the women, chose to leave on their own. She kind of, looked at why they left, and they chose to leave on their own. And she didn't go into why. She didn't dig into why yet. I think this is like just the beginning of her research. But I think some of the respondents' comments are quite illuminating. I think one, let me see if I can find it. One was a woman saying, "I often felt like I was being preyed on. I trusted white female bosses to be my allies, but in the end, I felt like they tore my heart out and stomped on it. I wasn't allowed to own my ideas; they were theirs, and they took them without the value of years of my work that went into formulating them. I'm still a bit heartbroken." I mean, these are like the anecdotal stories. One is like being a tough Black woman. You're seen as, if you're a serious journalist, you're seen as you're perceived as angry. She said, "I was once told I didn't smile enough. If you advocated for a different angle in storytelling, you were told you were often dismissed." But those are like just kind of the kind of climate in newsrooms that led to them just choosing to leave altogether. I think you saw in the 60s the same kind of conversation about diversity in the newsroom. When the civil rights movement, they look around and they realize the news desks aren't diverse, have people of color. Similarly, we have Black Lives Matter movement now, which is considered, has been considered really been called the largest protest movement in history. And, they're looking around and they're seeing they have no Black people in their newsrooms. And the few that they have are, often overworked and overburdened. They're trying to, cover the story and in many ways be a part, they're a part of the story. I've seen a lot of articles about Black journalists who were, being racially profiled, being arrested, having run-ins with editors over how they choose to, wanted to frame the story. So I think, the challenge is going to be, I think there'll be a move like there is now for more, hiring more Black journalists. well, it'd be interesting to see how long they stay. When you look at that the Levers project, but I still believe there's a need for us to be in all of these spaces. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I think though, it just like, systemic racism that we've seen in all of these other fields, the same problems in journalism that will have to be addressed, at some point, if we're really to have the true diversity, and have the numbers of Black reporters stay in those organizations. And like I said, I still would like to see more owners. It's exciting to see, and at least encouraged by the philanthropy here in California that's really interested in that as well. Like, they're interested in supporting legacy, but they're also interested in, like, how we can support new startups.
Thank you for your response and your honesty. I really appreciate your insight and everything that you've been sharing with us today. I also would like to take this moment in the middle of our student panel just to remind the audience to please go ahead and type questions that you have in the Q&A feature below. I'll pose the questions to Dr. Brown-Hinds once we reach the audience Q&A. I have one more question. What role will the Black press play in the upcoming election, especially given historic pick of Kamala Harris as the first Black and Asian vice presidential candidate?
That's exciting. What's interesting is campaign season is normally the most profitable time for the Black press. You have candidates, campaign consultants, special interests, all trying to get Black voters, and it's interesting to see that happen during like campaign season. I think actually one of the reasons here in California, the Black press did maybe a little better than some other community media when it comes to the challenges with the pandemic and the slowing down or basic stoppage of the economy, was that during our primary season, we saw some decent advertising that help us get through. But I think the role that the Black press will play would be really significant in certain states, those with larger Black voting populations, as well as some of the battleground states like North Carolina, Florida, Michigan. I think that they'll play a key role in educating voters on how to vote during the pandemic, right? Motivating them to participate, trying to combat any mis or disinformation as trusted messengers. That's a role we can play in our communities. It's not necessarily just, it's not talking about who to vote for, even though I'm sure they will be taking major editorial positions. But it's also just educating them on how to safely vote. I recently was reading a study. I'm doing some work for on the consulting side, actually, for the LA County as part of the LA County Registrar's Office, knowing the historic challenge we are going to have in November, getting people to vote. And one of the things they found in some of their early polling was, more than any other racial group, Black voters in particular were concerned about their vote counting, and they were concerned about their safety due to the coronavirus, because they, at least this group, they kind of over-indexed in voting at the polls, and which was interesting. Like, so the voting by mail, in all that the administration is trying to do to suppress that, we have to talk about. We have to let people know. We need to make sure we inform people that their vote will count. Help them understand how to vote safely, and We need to be, like editorializing about the importance of voting by mail. And we need to kind of diligently monitor any suppression tactics that we see in our community, if we see them, right? Call them out. And that's what we're going to have to do. I think that's the role we'll definitely play. I mean, it's historic with Kamala there, but like it's also historic because we're in a pandemic. We have an administration that is doing all that it can to suppress votes from people of color. And so that's, part of our job is to help inform with kind of this trusted messages from trusted messengers.
Thank you so much. We always see this big issue of will my vote count, or I don't really want to vote, especially like in this time of the pandemic. So just really thank you for touching upon it.
Yeah.
Our next question comes from Daisy.
Thank you, Camila. So I want to redirect a little bit my question back to the Black Lives Matter movement, Dr. Brown-Hinds. And, as we all know, since it began, it has brought a great amount of coverage in the press and protests regarding the deaths of Black men. But we don't see nearly the same coverage for Black women, nor Black trans women who are victims of the same violence within the press. I wanted to ask, why do you think this is, and what can we do to change it within our media?
Yes. I think, well, part of it is like, in this, I think is and I think about it as a person with a background in literature. We organize the world through narrative, right? It's how we organize everything we see and do. Stories help us understand what we see. And I think the dominant narrative when it comes to who is killed by the police is Black men. Professor Kimberly Crenshaw just started this Say Her Name, like a hashtag Say Her Name campaign, because Black women have been invisible in these conversations about interactions with law enforcement. She wants to reinsert Black women back into that narrative, and I think Black trans women are even more invisible in that space. We have to do a better job of telling those stories. Like we really do. And like I said, being under-resourced for so long, it's sometimes challenging for us, but we have to find ways to tell that story. If we don't do it, no one will. I think about the George Floyd incident, because that's part of it. I think when George Floyd was killed, and you had Breonna Taylor killed in Kentucky, and but there was just that kind of catalytic, it was a kind of catalytic incident when you look at George Floyd, and I keep wondering why that incident. We've seen people killed by the police, so it wasn't just that he was killed by the police. We've seen them, shot. We've seen them bleeding. We've seen them, and we've heard the horror stories. I think with George Floyd, there were just this kind of a convergence of things, because it's like the veil was lifted for some people. And I think timing was a part of it. You had the pandemic, I mentioned earlier, where we started to hear about all the racial disparities in healthcare, in workforce, in living conditions, all these things that contributed to Blacks having, at one point, more susceptible and dying from it at a higher rate than others. And then you had the Ahmaud Arbery shooting video that surfaced, a few weeks before that. So it was just like this kind of freshness. I remember even, I don't know if you remember seeing that Chris Cooper, the guy who was in Central Park bird watching, and then the white woman who was like, mad because he said, put your dog on a leash, and she's like, and, like all of that happening. And then there was like the vantage point of that video of George Floyd, where you see him, you see his face, and you see, this officer's face in the same frame. You hear this person begging for their life, calling for their mother, and you see this kind of indifferent face, draining the life out of this person. And I think that's probably why there was a catalyst for this, huge calls for change that we've seen, and global calls for change that we've seen. But I think when it, once again, that goes back into that narrative, that dominant narrative of like Black men. So it'll be our job and just do a better job of really reinserting women into that narrative.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it goes back to accountability. What are we doing in our parts, all of us, right, to show these disparities, especially with Black women and Black transgender women.
Right.
And you did mention George Floyd and the coverage that he got versus the coverage that Breonna Taylor got. I wanted to ask, what's your opinion on this, contrast in coverage between, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor?
I think with Breonna Taylor, we don't have coverage, right? We don't have footage, right? And I think that one thing video has enabled us to do is it's kind of like this eyewitness to these things. So I think that was a part of it. I think it goes back to also the policies, right? The muddiness of what happened with her. I think is a part of it, but there's still, there's she's on the cover. Is it Vanity Fair this month? There's there's a movement to try to find some type of justice, right? Change policies, police policies. You shouldn't have these no-knock warrants. There's a move for that, but then there's also this move for justice in that case. I think we're going to continue to hear calls for justice, and I think they will continue to grow. And this isn't going away, right? But I think with Floyd, it was just the nature, the vantage point of that video that I think it just changed it for so many people. I admit I never watched the full thing. I remember when it happened. Because of our remote work life, I sit in my room on a computer all day working, and I'll go into the living room like at the end of the day, and some cable news is on. My mother-in-law's watching, so I really didn't even know what was happening until like my husband, he disappeared, and I didn't, and I could tell something was wrong, and I was like, what just happened? And then I started kind of seeing the sharing on social media of this footage. I think so many people could put themselves in that position too, right? They see themselves, and I think that's one of the other reasons that it had that kind of catalytic. It was kind of a catalytic experience. I mean, that's my opinion on that. But we definitely have to do a better job. And I think I haven't looked to see even what some of the Kentucky. I'm not sure if we have a Black paper in Kentucky. I need to check on that. We still have hundreds. I didn't say this in the opening, but we have still hundreds of Black newspapers across this country that are still, committed to doing this kind of social justice work, and they do it in their community. I haven't bothered to see who's working that in Kentucky though, at a local level. There's a national interest, but I'm curious about the local level.
Thank you for your perspective. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Paulette Brown-Hinds. Our next question is coming from Maddie.
So you know, with the Black Lives Matter movement, I've noticed a wide array of calls for justice, from individual cases such as George Floyd and charging the cops who murdered him, and broader calls for justice, including defunding the police. Some people have called it abolishing, reimagining. There's a lot going on just about law enforcement in general. So I'm wondering, as a Riverside Police Foundation board member, what are your thoughts on this idea of reimagining, reconstructing? You know, everyone, there's different degrees to it, from abolishing to defending. What are your thoughts?
I love that you found that board service. I do Riverside Police Foundation board. I was actually asked by some community leaders to join that board, and it's really a project of the police chief, and our former police chief Sergio Diaz here in Riverside, a great relationship with, and they fund organizations that are in the community doing work with youth. So I can't speak as a board member, but I can speak from different perspectives on this question you have. As a civically engaged community member, I'm really concerned about kind of the militarization of the police force. I'm like an advocate for community policing. I believe police unions have way too much power. They have control over our elected leaders. I'm sure as public policy students, you probably study some of that dynamic. They gain control by, funding political campaigns, supporting candidates, going after candidates that they don't like. They use scare tactics. They often, even trick the community into funding increases. And it just continues to expand the public safety budgets way too much. We're doing some work. We're doing some work around that right now. Very interested. My team's really interested in that. As the mother of a Black son, I have a now 27-year-old. I've always been fearful of what might happen to him. I actually wrote a column about it, about his touches with the police that I had never asked him about until I had gone to a panel discussion that featured the district attorney, and it featured someone with the CHP, someone with Riverside Sheriff's Department. And I came home and I asked my son, I said, how many times have you been stopped by the police? I was amazed that at this point, he was in his early 20s. He had 17. He started counting. He started just counting them. And it was like 17 times. Walking in our neighborhood, walking in his friend's neighborhood, stopped and handcuffed. They go, they frisk him, they search him, stopped him in his car. What was interesting to me is though he never had a ticket, right? So I'm like, wait, we've gotten stopped all of those times. And so I ended up writing this column about it. And actually the chief at the time called me like as soon as I hit send and it went out. It was my newsletter. He's like, wait, are these my guys? He was, but he, eventually was stopped at gunpoint. I think that was the final thing, for him by sheriff's deputies. And it was just a case of mistaken identity, right? So I know from a personal perspective, there needs to be a reimagining of policing in our communities. I'm not an expert on the subject. I know there are models out there. I don't know what they are because I'm not an expert, but I know there are models out there. As a newspaper, a publisher, I advocate for transparency. I really want our team to really dig into data and find stories that could lead to greater reform. So right now, they're writing a piece that it actually started before the protests started, before the George Floyd killing. I got a call from someone at a law enforcement agency, I won't say which one, who works there, and it's like a racial discrimination issues, like major racial discrimination issues. So, at first people weren't willing to go on the record, and now they are. So we're like, doing that story, and I didn't know it's taken, probably 5 months of just doing research, requesting certain records. And now it's going to be like this 5-part series that we're working on. These are kind of types of stories that, we want to do. We're digging into the police shooting of a few years, it was 2 years ago, or last year, Lawrence Bender. It happened in San Bernardino. The local Black Lives Matter chapter is really kind of like focused on that. Our team was looking into it and said there was some discrepancies in the way the officer, what they saw on video and what the officer said to his superior happened. And so it's taken longer just to kind of dig into that. And then once the story's written, we have like a strategy on where it should go. We just published a story talking about defunding the police on a sales tax measure in San Bernardino that just made it onto the November ballot. And we think that money can easily be redirected to the police department, to funding the high salaries of folks in that department. And what's really interesting about that police department is only like, I think maybe 5 officers live in the city. So they don't live in the city. Their salaries are so much more than the average member of the community there. So tax dollars are going to fund these officers to create this kind of police state there, and they take that money into their own communities and lift up their own communities, right? And that's how we talk about the story. So our team actually did a nice chart kind of showing how much the average retail worker, warehouse worker, CNA, and then how much the average police officer, and then how much the police chief makes. So ridiculous. So that we just released that story, and we're asking voters to really look at that before they vote for that sales tax measure. It's just going to be more money in the budget that goes to support the department. It can. And then we're working on collecting data statewide on just how much of city budgets are going to policing. So we want to create a map, part of the GIS work we're doing. We want to create a map on that data and highlight the overwhelming investment in law enforcement instead of crime prevention, instead of mental health services, or instead of, social service support.
Wow, I did not know that about San Bernardino. I'm an LA County native. I'm here right now, but attending UCR and learning about issues and just details of the Inland Empire and what's going on there, has opened up my world a lot. And I am so sorry about your son. Hearing stories like that, finding out that it's normal or just part of someone's day it angers me so much, and it should not be that way. So thank you for all the work you're doing to at a community level. I think that is what's so amazing about the Black Lives Matter movement, is that it's national, even international, but to have the LA, i.e. you have I think it's organized very well from what I know, where they also do community work. So they're focusing on every level, which I think we need that pressure right now to get things done.
No, I agree. And one thing I appreciate about my new young team is that they are covering, the community work that Black Lives Matter IE is doing, right? The kind of helping, give give, the food giveaways. People are really struggling right now. They're helping with that. They're telling the stories of the protests, like the Lawrence Bender story. Like, they're bringing up important issues, and so our team, which has been great, has really tried to lift those up too in our work. They've interviewed the local chapter founders, and then they're looking at things still with certain things with a journalistic eye. But I think what they're doing is really important, and I do like that they're kind of organized regionally or locally, because the work that we do as a community newspaper is really much more focused on the local.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brown-Hinds, for answering questions from our public policy student panel. At this time, I will now open it up for audience Q&A. We have a lot of questions from our audience members, so we'll try to get through them the best we can. Our first question is from Sean. Sean asks, we are in the process of starting a progressive newspaper to rival the only two local conservative papers. We petitioned the state and are about to file not-for-profit status with the IRS. We will be community-led by like-minded individuals in accordance with our bylaws. Do you have any suggestions for them?
Where are they? You don't know where they're located, huh? There's a nonprofit news organization. It's either the Institute for Nonprofit News, or it's a national organization, but they do really good work. They work with nonprofit news outlets. They even have funding opportunities, especially if they're going nonprofit. There's a lot of money right now in philanthropy for news, for local news, and for new ideas in news. So I would point them to that nonprofit news organization, and then also the local media association. They're doing some interesting work with matching up, and I just signed up for this. I think it's in a beta right now, matching up news organizations and funders who want to fund a specific type of organization. And so it's called News Fuel, I believe is what it's called, News Fuel. And they just recently launched, and they launched it as beta. So I don't even know if you could find it, but you can at least find out about it. I would definitely look at local media association and that nonprofit news organization. And if they're local, they can always reach out to me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown-Hinds. Our next question comes from Ivory. Their question is, one of the discussions emerging in this current racial reconciliation moment is around the Black journalists and whether they are able to be objective. Can you please share your thoughts about this line of thinking and the subtext that white journalists are inherently objective?
You know what? There is a really good article, and I can't quote her. Oh gosh, see if I can find it. There's a really good article that talks about objectivity. Here it is. It is by a professor at Purdue named Kim Gallon, Gallon. It's called What the Mainstream News Media Can Learn from the History of the Black Press in the Age of a Pandemic. And it talks specifically about the history of objectivity in journalism, and how the Black press, did not want to reinforce white supremacy, unwittingly reinforce it by having like we consider neutral coverage of something. So they had to create a kind of an approach to rooting out the lies, but also combating the injustice. and reframe what you think about when you say objectivity. So there's like a whole section in that article about objectivity. So look it up. It is what the mainstream news media can learn from the history of the Black press in the age of a pandemic. And it's Professor Kim Gallant.
Thank you again, Dr. Paulette Brown-Hinds. We have another question. It's given anonymously. It says, given the recent changes of the U.S. Postal Service, have you heard from any national Black publishers that they are experiencing any delays in the delivery of their publications to subscribers who may still receive Black newspapers by mail, if any? And are there nationwide initiatives, online or print, among Black publishers to advise readerships about voter suppression efforts involving mail, including delivery of campaign materials for Black candidates or receiving and returning ballots?
Yes, I haven't seen a national movement yet, but I'm sure, so there's an organization, the National Newspaper Publishers Association, which is it's like the trade association for the Black press, and hundreds of us belong to that association. I'm sure that will be, there will be some guidelines and conversation that we have and pushing out information to our readership. I haven't seen it yet, and I'm sure there will be. I haven't heard of the slowdown from any of my colleagues. I can tell you I've just seen it because we send out ours via mail as well. We send out some via mail as well. There's always the problem with kind of the third class mail. So we've been first class mail. I'm seeing it just in general. And there it is, it is a deep concern that we have, but I'm sure in terms of like a larger scale strategy for information dissemination, we'll be hearing from NMPA, and if we don't, that's something I'll actually want to take to them. That's a good question. Thank you.
So unfortunately, that is all the time we have right now for questions. I'm so sorry that we could not get through everyone's questions. They were amazing questions because we have so many more of them. But we will forward any of the questions, well, the remainder of the questions and comments from the chat box and the Q&A box to Dr. Brown-Hinds after the event. I would like to once again thank Dr. Brown-Hinds for just taking the time out of your very busy schedule to join us today for this very important talk. And I want to thank all of you for attending and supporting our webinar series. You can learn more about the UCR School of Public Policy seminar series at spp.ucr.edu. And we will see you all at our next event. Thank you.
Thank you.